Hello. It's good to see you all. Thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Brakey. I got my start in liberty politics as a young, rabble-rousing grassroots activist who somehow landed a job on the Ron Paul campaign, became the state director in Maine, one of the few states that we won, though he had a really strong second-place finish here in New Hampshire. I went on from that. I served 2 terms in the Maine State Senate. I ousted a 36-year Democrat incumbent who had never lost a race before in a landslide just by getting out there, knocking doors, talking with people about how we fix our problems with more liberty, not more government. I served 2 terms there. As was mentioned, I passed constitutional carry. That was back when it was still like an impressive thing because so few states had it. And I used to be able to brag about, to all my friends in New Hampshire. It's like, yeah, you guys call yourself the free state, but, you know, you don't have constitutional carry. And what's the deal with, you know, all your marijuana laws? Well, now at least I can still brag about our marijuana laws being better, but you guys, actually your constitutional carry is a little bit better than ours. Yours starts at 18, ours starts at 21 and all that. But I left the state Senate in 2018 to run for the U.S. Senate. I was the Republican nominee against our current senator, Angus King. So since he's our current senator, you can kind of figure out how that went. I then ran for Congress. That didn't work out. Republican establishment really didn't want me there and spent about $500,000 against me. But after that, I spent the next year plus working with Young Americans for Liberty, working to help this model of getting liberty activists elected to state legislatures across the country. I've become very convinced that if we are going to turn things around in our country, if we're going to preserve liberty in America, it's never going to come from Washington, D.C. It's going to have to come from the states. It's going to have to come from regular people getting involved, running for office, and using the constitutional power of the state legislatures to fight back against this apparatus in Washington, D.C., which is supposed to be following this document called the Constitution, but seems to have the power never intended for them to determine the extent of their own powers under the Constitution and reinterpret it to mean whatever they want. And so that's where we are today with this city hundreds of miles away from us, which happens to be the richest region in America for some reason, even though they don't really produce anything of value. We all know this, right? 5 richest counties in America are all suburbs of Washington, D.C., but they're not known for manufacturing or agriculture or finance or anything that isn't really connected to this apparatus of plunder, legal plunder as Bastiat would call it, and they're very good at stealing from us, and they've gotten very rich on this. So, that's where we are today. Now, I was asked to come here and talk about an idea that I've been thinking a lot about over the last decade or so, but is, I think, somewhat of a novel idea in terms of how we fight back against some of the federal tyrannies in this country. I have not seen this put forward as legislation before, but I think that now that we are getting to a point where we have so many liberty legislators elected across the country, especially in states like New Hampshire, but also to a lesser degree in states across the country. I think we're over 200 Ron Paul style liberty legislators elected across the country, I believe in now about 37 states. When I was in the state Senate from 2014 to 2018, we didn't have anything like that. It was kind of like, you know, if you're being really generous, you could count up the amount of real Ron Paul-style liberty legislators in this country. You could count them up on like 2 hands if you're being generous. Now, you know, they could fill up a pretty big auditorium. This is progress that's been made, especially here in states like New Hampshire. So now that we're getting to this critical mass of liberty legislators in state capitals, what can we do with this? Obviously, there's great things that are happening, like school choice being passed here in New Hampshire, constitutional carry spreading across the country, more and more states being willing to stand up and proactively nullify unconstitutional federal laws, like states that are passing things like the Second Amendment Preservation Act. I think there was something passed like that recently here in New Hampshire, if I'm not wrong. telling the federal government that your unconstitutional gun grabs are not recognized within our state borders and we will not enforce it. I'd love to go even further and tell all these federal officials that do try to enforce it that they'll be treated like any other kidnapper or any other criminal trying to steal people's property and charged under state law for crimes of theft and kidnapping if they try to go after peaceful people who are simply exercising their Second Amendment rights. There's always more to do. But there's a lot of good progress happening for liberty under this banner of nullification. But this idea of tax nullification is not something that I have seen put forward before in state legislatures, and it's something that I think I'm trying to flesh out a little bit more and advocate that this is something that we can look at the state level. So what is tax nullification in the first place? How does it help us? What does it do? And why is it justified? Well, first I think, well, let me, I guess, go back a little bit. The first time I ever encountered this idea was 10 years ago in a great book, which maybe some folks in this room have read. If not, you should read it. A book called Nullification by the great Tom Woods. And this, it's about nullification generally, and this idea of tax nullification was in there basically as a footnote on one page. It was kind of just a side remark, but it really got me thinking. We live under this system where the federal government takes our money from us and ransoms it back to us with strings attached to get the states to fall into compliance with their unconstitutional laws and unconstitutional mandates. Now, New Hampshire has been better than most states at resisting this. I think about, New Hampshire is the only state in the country that doesn't have a seatbelt law for adults over the age of 18, despite the fact that the federal government actively bribes states with their own money to pass such laws. I'm a fan of seatbelts. I think people should wear seatbelts, but I'm not a fan of government sticking a gun in people's face and saying you have to do something for your own good when you're not hurting anyone else. Of course, I think as libertarians, we understand that distinction. But this is the mechanism that they use, not just for, we could argue, seatbelt laws are arguably trivial things. Certainly when I put in a bill to abolish the seatbelt law in the state of Maine, I was called pretty crazy, and the timing kind of sucked because the bill hearing was like a week after the largest multi-car pileup in state history. That wasn't good timing. It happens. The lobbyists were like out the door like a mile long, and there was like me and one other person there to like testify in favor of repealing this. But this is the mechanism. So when we look beyond just like trivial things like seatbelt laws, we also have much more serious policies in which the federal government is trying to bribe the states with our own money to do unconstitutional things. I bet we can all think of like a very glaring example that's been in the news lately. What is that? What's the example that's been in the news lately where the federal government is trying to bribe states with our own money to pass unconstitutional laws that would violate the Second Amendment rights and the due process rights of the people? Red flag laws. Exactly. So this is one of those things. Red flag laws. Clearly unconstitutional. Right? Not only does it violate the Second Amendment, it violates basic Fifth Amendment rights to due process, the fact that your liberties could be taken from you without even having committed a crime, on the idea, like Minority Report, that you might commit a crime sometime in the future. Your liberties, your property can be confiscated from you with no notice, no due process, except for that 5 a.m. knock on the door by government agents saying, we're here with a red flag order, give us your guns. That doesn't always work out so well. It hasn't worked out well in places like Maryland, where people have been shot, killed in their own homes in those pre-dawn knocks on their door, because of course most gun owners understand and have mentally prepared what happens if that day comes and the government comes and they say, we're here to confiscate your guns. It's a dangerous situation for everyone, but the federal government is trying to bribe us into compliance with this nonetheless. So what can we do about it? Obviously, we can fight on the federal level. We can fight to defeat these bills. We can be like New Hampshire and try to resist the allure of getting our own money back to us with all these strings attached. But I think that we need to start looking at doing something more than this. So if we go back to the Articles of Confederation, it was actually, I think, a pretty nice arrangement we had, where the federal government had to beg the states for money rather than the other way around. But we did pass the Constitution. There's a lot of good things in the Constitution. Some things we can agree or disagree on. A lot of good things in the Constitution. But we did pass the Constitution. That did give direct taxation authority to the federal government. But, of course, the states are the parties to the Constitution. The states created the federal government. And the states only gave the federal government the authority to tax people for constitutional purposes. Right? Article 1, Section 8, we gave them a whole list of clearly defined powers that belong to the federal government and said, yeah, 10th Amendment, beyond that, you can't really do anything else. Of course, that hasn't stopped them. We have endless unconstitutional wars. We have spy agencies that regularly violate our due process rights. And of course, to add insult to injury, they bribe us with our own money to get our state politicians to fall into compliance with this. And of course, as someone who's been in the state legislatures, I know that politicians on the state level feel like federal money is free money. Why would we not take it? Of course, the cost is always the strings attached that come with it. But why would we not take it? Everyone feels good when we can maximize the amount of federal dollars that we bring in, no matter how many liberties we have to surrender in order to get them. So tax nullification would do this. It would use state power to fight state power. It would use state power to fight Washington, D.C.'s unconstitutional power. Imagine if we had, say, 13 states in this country that passed laws saying, we are going to put the state government in between our state taxpayers and the IRS. So the people of New Hampshire, the people of Maine, the people of Idaho, whatever state, will no longer pay the taxes assessed by the federal government directly to the IRS. We will pay it instead to the state. The state will hold it in trust. Pending what? Pending a review of the federal budget on the basis of constitutionality. Is what what they are intending to use these dollars for from our citizens, our taxpayers, are these actually for programs that have been authorized under the U.S. Constitution or not? If there is a review, and we would need to figure out the details on how this review is conducted. Maybe it's conducted by the state legislatures. Maybe the state legislatures say, we're going to flag things that we think are unconstitutional, and we're going to have our state courts evaluate whether it's constitutional or not. We can figure out the mechanics of it. But after that review is done, let's say we find that, let's be generous, 40% of what the federal government does spends our money on. Let's say that's constitutional, found to be constitutional. All right, well, the state has all this money that's been gathered up from the people. Let's only send 40% to the federal government. Only 40% of what they're doing is constitutional. They only get 40% of the money that they say that our people owe them. What do you do with the remaining 60%? You can do one of two things. Obviously, the best thing is to give it back to the people. It's their money, they earned it, they should be able to keep it. But then there's also this sticky problem of, what about all those federal programs or things funded with federal dollars, which of course was our money to begin with that they took from us and ransomed back to us with strings attached. A lot of people like those programs. A lot of people like, we can, as libertarians, we can have a debate about how we feel about roads, but a lot of people like those federally funded roads. So you can take that money and you can send it back to the people, or you could also supplant federal funds lost when the federal government stomps their feet and says, you can't do this, we're going to cut your federal funds. And they say, that's fine, you can cut our federal funds. You know why? Because we have the federal funds. So we'll just pay for the highways ourselves with those monies we did not send to Washington, D.C. So that's how tax nullification would work. Now, of course, I know that working in legislative bodies and working with politicians. Politicians are risk-averse people, and getting something like this to pass is challenging, especially in small states, whereas a small state, we often feel like we're so tiny compared to Washington, D.C. We're so tiny compared to the federal government. We can't dare defy them because they will crack down on us hard. That's probably true. A state like New Hampshire went alone on this. I mean, frankly, the folks in the state of New Hampshire probably have the balls to go alone and do it. But in a lot of states, passing something like that in clear defiance of the federal government, in defense of the taxpayers of the state, in defense of the Constitution that the federal government is supposed to be living under, a lot of legislators and politicians would be afraid to go it alone. So I also think that perhaps states should pass something like this with a trigger clause, that this will go into effect once this legislation has been passed in, say, 13 states. Why 13 states? Maybe it's just a little bit of historic romanticism. 13 states were able to stand up to a very tyrannical power in the past. I think that 13 states could do it again. And when a bunch of small states across the country, with liberty legislators elected to state capitals across the country, are standing together, then those small states don't look so small anymore. And I think that's where we're getting to as far as the critical mass of liberty legislators that were getting elected in state capitals. We can start to do much more interesting things fighting back against unconstitutional federal power. So, again, this is not an idea that, to my knowledge, has been put forward in a state legislative body in the past. It's something I would like to see us start to look at more seriously. And in the next legislature, after the supposed red wave that's coming, if we get a bunch of liberty legislators to ride in on that red wave across the country, we're in a position to start doing some very interesting things. Because, and it's not just, of course, as we all know, it's not just, in the liberty movement. By and large, more and more people in the public are getting fed up with the tyranny coming out of Washington, D.C. People are fed up with it. Whether we like Donald Trump or not, we can certainly recognize that the fact that he was elected in the first place was a repudiation of just how frustrated people are getting with all this. And I think that we are entering a moment where now's the time for the states to be bold. So, anyway, that's my idea, something that I intend to sponsor in Maine. Should I win, I'm running for the state senate, for my old state senate seat this November. It's something that I would like to sponsor in Maine. I would love to work with legislators in New Hampshire to have something similar sponsored here, and with the whole coalition of liberty legislators we're getting elected across the country to start pushing back in serious ways. Ways that do not just tackle the symptoms of the tyranny in Washington, D.C., but ways that actually undermine the very apparatus in which they tyrannize us, which is the system of legal plunder that they use for unconstitutional spending. So that's what I got. I'd be happy to have conversation with you all, happy to take any questions about it. And, or even we can talk about other topics. I don't know how much time I have. I don't see anyone with a hook ready to pull me off the stage. So, yeah, hey.
I love the idea. It's very innovative. My sense is, as I was listening to it, was it needs to be fleshed out a little bit in terms of public relations with Joe and Jill Normie.
Yeah.
It's great. We spent a little bit of time hearing about it. I love it. I'm sure there's a lot of people here that love it, but actually articulating that, making that clear to an actual voter, I think might be the challenge. I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts on how that could effectively be done.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is the thing with any kind of major public policy is how do you boil it down into the 30-second soundbite that the average person can understand and that it resonates with them. And I mean, I think it's probably a lot more thought needs to be given to what the proper messaging is, but I do think it's probably going to be something along the lines of, pick your favorite unconstitutional federal program to hate. Whether it's the wars, whether it's the surveillance state, whether it's the, pick what it is. I mean, you can't swing a bat in Washington, D.C. without hitting an unconstitutional program. And I think kind of messaging on this is about, people, this is about us, we the people standing up against kind of out of control federal government, which of course we've seen messaging along similar lines resonate with people in past populist movements, whether it was the rise of Donald Trump, whether it was the Tea Party movement. That populist angst, I think, is still very much there, and I think messaging to that populist angst against Washington, D.C. is how you get a broad coalition on board. Yeah.
So once you get New Hampshire, Maine, whoever wants to join in at the very start, do you see people falling in line slowly, or it's wishful thinking? Do you see a waterfall of states joining in all at the same time?
So I think, like a lot of things that were once considered radical and are now considered mainstream, like constitutional carry, for example, probably it happened slowly and then all at once, right? Like constitutional carry, we went from, what was it, like into the George W. Bush administration, you had 2 states with constitutional carry, Vermont and Alaska. Then under the first term of Barack Obama, it doubled. Then under the second term of Barack Obama, it doubled again. Then under Donald Trump, it doubled again. And under Joe Biden, it's doubling again. And now we're at like I think we may be on track to like 32 states by the time we get Joe Biden out of there in 2024. So it always is, the hardest thing is who goes first, which is why I like this idea of the trigger clause. Because especially on something like this, where, constitutional carry, the effectiveness of it was once a few states did it and people saw that, oh, it didn't turn into the wild, wild west like all the Michael Bloomberg groups predicted, that emboldened other states to like come on board. It's like, oh, what, Maine and New Hampshire actually became safer states with lower violent crime rates when law-abiding citizens could have unrestricted carrying of firearms. Once you have those kind of examples, that sells there. This would be a little different, of course, because you have that looming threat of Washington, D.C., which is why I like this idea of the trigger clause. Once you get a few states first to be bold and pass it, maybe in the next legislative cycle, then other states might see, wow, look at what Maine and New Hampshire did. Maybe Idaho should come on board. Maybe we should, and we can progressively get there to 13 states when it triggers. But thank you for the question.
I have no problem with it, but it seems like the IRS, their first response would be to not recognize it, basically, and say, hey, you got to file your taxes, you got to e-file, you got to do whatever, and we'll go after you if you don't. So if they go after you, the citizens of that state, then doesn't there have to be a secondary thing that gets triggered? Like, I don't know, say you got to recognize that what our state gave you is good enough, and you can't go after the individuals. And if you do,
right.
X happens, like a secession or something, which I also have no problem with it.
Right. So the state would need to protect its citizens. So if the IRS wants to come and try to arrest people for not paying their taxes to the IRS when they paid it instead to the state, and the state passed on what was constitutional to the federal government, if the state comes and tries to arrest someone, well, we should treat those federal agents like kidnappers and charge them under state law for kidnapping. I think that's how that needs to be handled. You need to use state power to push back against unconstitutional federal power. Yeah. So you're asking if they go after companies that exist. Yeah. It may be harder to accomplish when we're talking about big companies that may operate in the state, but I think it's probably the easiest place to do this is when we're talking about the individual income tax for the person, where we can protect an individual. Someone who is operating kind of in multiple states, across state lines, as a big business might be harder to accomplish. That's something probably we need to look at a little bit more in depth, how that's handled. There's a lot that needs to be fleshed out. I want to be completely upfront about this. There's a lot about this that needs to be fleshed out. It is a new idea, and it's probably something that will be, we can flesh out as much as we can before the bill goes in, and then kind of part of the trial and error process of the legislative process. You kind of go through, you hear objections. Maybe you get it passed the first time. Maybe you learn some things and you improve it for the second go around. But yeah, this is with new ideas. So yeah, there's going to be some stuff that needs to be fleshed out. Yeah.
So off the back of that last comment, do you think it might be more effective to get the mechanism in place where the states pay the federal government without withholding first, so it's not seen as a threat, and then after that mechanism is in place, then start withholding unconstitutional things?
So certainly I'm open to the idea of kind of changing the structure of the payments first, but I guess I wonder what would be in some ways that seems harder to get past, because on the one hand it's more moderate, but also on the other hand, what's the what's going to motivate people to want to come out and support and push for something like that if all it's doing is kind of shuffling around how the money goes to Washington D.C. So I don't know. It's an interesting thought. If I'd be open to it if I thought there was a viable strategy in terms of taking the incremental steps to get us there. But my gut tells me that we need to ask for the full deal up front. And hey, if that was offered as a compromise, take half the loaf and come back for the second half of the loaf later, I'm totally cool with that. But I think we need to start with asking for the whole loaf. Yeah.
Thank you. Before I ask my question, just so I make sure I understand this, your proposal relies on individuals not paying their federal taxes and relying on the state to defend them from federal enforcement of tax law? Is
Yes.
that the basic idea? Okay. It seems to me that this is setting the state up for basically a constitutional showdown, because the federal government defends its taxation of individuals based on the Constitution,
Certainly.
the 16th Amendment, and so it seems like this would get fought through the courts, and you would basically have to say that the 16th Amendment itself, passing the 16th Amendment, was somehow unconstitutional, and basically get income tax removed from the Constitution.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the Supreme Court's going to side with the federal government, and they're going to send in the army or whoever they have to do to enforce the the Constitution as they see it.
Yeah. So a few things there. Good questions. A few things to break down there. One, things ending up in court and there being a court battle over it, I don't see that as a bad thing. I think the fact that even the federal government has to defend itself in court over these sorts of things, that's better than where we are now, where they don't even feel the need to defend themselves. They just tax us and spend our money on unconstitutional purposes with impunity, and it just kind of just goes.
I agree. I like to see these things challenged in court.
So the other thing, I don't agree that the legal argument for this rests upon the 16th Amendment being invalid. We're not saying they don't have the constitutional authority to directly tax people, to do an income tax on people. I know some smarter people than me have argued that and gone to jail for it, actually. I'm thinking of Irwin Schiff here. What it is relying on is the legal argument that the authority of the federal government to tax the people through something like an income tax, that authority only extends to using those monies for constitutional purposes, to defend the country, to establish post offices, things you can find under Article 1, Section 8, that would not be guaranteed to the states and the people under the 10th Amendment. I know as libertarians, we could say the Constitution isn't a perfectly libertarian document and we might engineer it a different way, but I think we should use the legal structure of the Constitution to argue against this system that's supposed to operate under the Constitution. So the argument would be, the legal argument as I see it would be, sure, they can tax us, but they cannot tax us for unconstitutional spending purposes, and the states, as party to the contract of the Constitution, have an enforcement responsibility in enforcing the terms of the contract, which are clearly being violated. And as far as people being nervous about, well, is the state going to defend us? Is the federal government going to send in the army? I mean, that's why I'm favorable to this idea of a trigger clause, because if one state goes it alone, if New Hampshire goes it alone, it's much easier to send in the army or what have you, or crack down in whatever manner they might when it's one single small state standing alone. But when it's a multitude of states standing together, it's much harder for the federal government to come after all of us.
Okay, so it sounds like this is shifting the argument, though, from saying, we're not saying, the income tax is wrong in and of itself, but we're saying that some of the things that the income tax is being used to pay for are unconstitutional. And so then the federal government, it seems like their argument would then say, well, then challenge those things in court, but you can't challenge the income tax itself, and we're going to continue to tax you and try to enforce that taxation. If you have a problem with the things we're spending money on, then send us a legal challenge about this. But we don't want to talk about taxation because, according to us, it's all the taxation itself is constitutional, but also all of the things that we're spending the money on.
Yeah, so let me say here. So I did not come up here today to argue that the income tax is unconstitutional. I think someone could make that argument. That's not the argument I'm here to make. I certainly would love to see the income tax totally abolished, but that's not what this legislation is seeking to do. It's seeking to challenge the constitutional authority to spend monies, however they tax us, to spend monies on unconstitutional purposes. So I wouldn't agree that it's shifting the argument because I was never making that argument. And I'm trying to remember the second half of what you were saying there.
Well, I was saying that they would then just basically tell you, challenge us on those particular programs. Sue the government and say, hey, you can't, you couldn't have passed that law that funded that agency that does that thing that we say is unconstitutional or whatever. And then they're just going to say, you got to pay us the income tax, and if you have a problem with a particular program, you've just got to challenge that particular program. You can't withhold your income tax.
Well, they could
legally.
They could say that with all kinds of federal laws. They could say that with cannabis prohibition. They could say, well, you can't just ignore cannabis prohibition. You can't just ignore that. I mean, it's a federal law. Challenge it in federal court if you really think it's unconstitutional. Well, we've seen how that's gone over the decades. It is a fortress of corruption in Washington, D.C. It is a system designed to protect its own power. I mean, despite some good rulings recently, like the federal courts are appointed by federal employees. And so this is what I'm proposing is certainly a radical reshifting of power back to the states in terms of constitutional interpretation. I don't think that we should have to go to the federal courts to have them rule on what the monies that they take from us are spent upon. I think, frankly, our state courts should be able to rule on this because it is the states that are the parties to the Constitution. It's the states that created the federal government. And you go back to the origins, it was very clearly understood that the states have have enforcement authorities in the constitutional compact that have atrophied over time, but I would argue that we need to bring them back again.
Okay. Well, thank you for the explanation. And,
yeah,
I am playing the devil's advocate.
No,
as close as possible to the actual devil.
And I appreciate it. I come to you with an idea that is new and needs more fleshing out as we go. And so the challenging and the looking for the weak spots in it is how we strengthen the proposal itself.
Quick question: is there model legislation or something online that we can look at to
Not
get
yet.
into the specifics? Or
Probably the model legislation will be when I put it in next year, and then and then folks in other states can look to that. But no, not at this point.
all right, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Hey.
How you doing? So I want to address a few points you made. I consider myself a semi-expert on this only because you talked about Orange Schiff going to prison.
Yeah.
Ed Brown up in New Hampshire he's still in jail right now.
Yeah.
So I was associated with that case. I did 12 and a half years on that.
Yeah.
So as far as the income tax goes, I think we're looking at it the wrong way. We're talking about definition. It's all federal taxation has to be apportioned. So the feds say to New Hampshire, you have 1 million people in your state, we want $1 million, dollar per head. The income tax is an excise tax. It's a privilege tax. So if you sell guns to the Army, they know you're ripping them off, so they want a cut of the action. Pete Hendrickson's really broken this down. He's gotten refund checks, and he's done pretty well with this. But assuming or hoping that the federal courts are going to grant you any form of justice is just, it's a pipe dream.
That's why I don't want to rely on the federal courts.
Well, yeah, but the problem is this. You bring a suit in state court against the feds. This is what they do. Oh, it's a federal issue, and kick it up. So I think it has to come more from us. It's not asking some guy in a black dress to tell me what's constitutional to spend money on.
Right.
It's you deciding what you want to spend money on. Taxes are for services rendered. You know what I mean? Not for wars in Ukraine. You want to pay for that? You want to go serve? Have fun. I might give you $5 to the
right. You can donate your own money or your own life.
So do you know what I'm saying? I think it should be more brought down to the individual level. So in New Hampshire, for instance, you have RSA 23.1, I think it is. But 25 signatures can get a warrant article put onto your town warrant for towns that still have town meeting. So I did that. I got 25 signatures from people in town. Actually 26, so I got one over. And to require the selectmen to ask the IRS 3 specific questions. Where is it required to pay the federal income tax? Where is the word income defined? It's not defined in the tax. And why do they always state that it's voluntary? IRS commissioners and so forth. So town meeting, one of the state reps shot me down, said, no, it's an issue for Concord and it's not here. But my point being is that people in New Hampshire have such an opportunity to affect major substantial change at the local level. So that's just want to kind of, I just don't focus on this federal, the feds are going to come to save us. They're not here to save us, and neither are the staties, because they're getting paid by the feds. You know what I mean? So
right, and this is a direct effort to sever that very corrupting influence of the federal government, where the states are dependent on federal funds. Of course, I mean that's a misnomer. Of course, there's no such thing as federal money. They didn't earn it; they stole it from us. So this is an effort to undermine that. And as far as the role that people have to enforce the Constitution, I think you're right. It comes down to, ultimately, I think every individual in this country, as a citizen of this country, has a role to play in enforcing the constitutional contract. But the states also have a very particular role that they have absconded with over the last century plus, because they've gotten addicted to those federal funds through this ransom and bribery scheme that the federal government has set up over us. And I will say one thing. I know that one objection I have heard in Maine sometimes when we challenge this federal funding is people say, well, isn't a state like Maine, and I imagine perhaps New Hampshire might be in this situation too, people say, well, these are net receiver states. You get more money from the federal government than you pay in, which frankly has always seemed kind of suspect to me. I have a strong suspicion that is based on the amount of tax dollars we pay in versus tax dollars we receive, not counting the trillions of dollars of debts that are accumulated on the federal level that will be paid by, well, now they're being paid by us. We used to say they're being paid by our children and our grandchildren. I guess the future is now. We're paying it now. The price being paid in inflation when they just print the currency and devalue the currency, and we pay the inflated prices at the grocery store and at the pump and everything else. So it's always struck me as very suspect when people say, oh, that there are all these net receiver states in America, when I know that we're also spending trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars overseas in the whole global empire. It's kind of weird to me how so many are net receivers. I think that we're not counting the debts and we're not counting the inflation.
Yeah, so my comment here has more to do with the actual tactics of this, and I would be in agreement with your goal.
Yeah, go ahead, shoot.
Of weakening the federal government, getting more to the states. But if that's the objective, I feel like we really have to work around the issue before tackling the issue itself. What does that mean? It means building coalitions between states to share very similar legislation that could get pushed around the same times. Because I think the success would be much more likely if a number of states or a group of states was doing this simultaneously to stretch the federal resources from tackling all of these cases at the same time, and also so the mistakes of one can be learned from another. So I think the success of this particular goal depends on those coalitions, and then also really just getting back the power at the state level first. Otherwise, forget about it. Even if there's a minority dedicated to this issue at the state level, you can get the word out and create the conversation. That's not a bad thing, but at the end of the day, it's not going to hold weight. And we need more liberty-minded people to be unified under a common platform, to be really on the same page. And you got to get control of the National Guards at that point, because there's no doubt that federal forces are. Yeah. So it's like when it comes down to just real politics, like you need the National Guard.
So so a few things there. First of all, I would say
State Guard.
So I agree on pretty much everything you said. When we talk about coalitions across the states, I'm pleased to tell you I think that coalition exists.
Cool.
I think it's called the Hazlitt Coalition. It's all the liberty legislators who, through efforts by folks like Young Americans for Liberty, shout out to Matt Pillars is here today from Young Americans for Liberty, and of course it's been a partnership with a lot of organizations. I know Young Americans for Liberty has been doing a lot of this work kind of across the states, but in the states, of course, you've got great organizations here that have been electing liberty legislators, and this is taking place across the country, though New Hampshire is a bit of an outlier that we're all very proud of. But so that coalition, I think, exists. It's growing. I think that we are going to, in this next election cycle, we're going to start to really achieve a critical mass across the states where things like this become possible for interstate collaboration on things like this. Because I think you're absolutely right, and this is why I think that on something like this, a trigger clause that this only goes into effect when X number of states have signed on, have passed similar legislation. I think that's valuable because it's the simple principle, they can't arrest all of us. Yeah. And as far as the National Guard goes, I guess I agree in principle. I mean, I would also like to see, Defend the Guard legislation passed. I think that's something I also support. I'll be speaking on a panel later today about that. And I think actually a trigger clause with Defend the Guard would really help, I think, push something like that forward too, where people are afraid to stand up to the federal government, just their one state alone. Of course, Defend the Guard doesn't necessarily mean that the states fully command the National Guard for these things. Just means the federal government can't send them into undeclared wars overseas. But of course, then at that point, if they threaten to cut off federal funding for the state National Guards because we're doing something like tax nullification, then it actually puts us in a situation where we say, well, all right, well, we're going to use those federal funds we're not sending to Washington, D.C. to fund our National Guard, and it actually puts the National Guard, would make the National Guards more accountable and directly responsive to the states, where constitutionally that's who they're supposed to answer to, than to the federal government, except in those clear times of, under the Constitution, of insurrection, invasion, or to enforce a constitutionally authorized, declaration of war. Those are the only times the federal government's supposed to have any say over the National Guard for kind of actual combat purposes.
Gotcha. What do federal subsidies look like, if anything, for energy in Maine and New Hampshire? Because I know there's some issues with energy, extra high energy costs here. Yeah. And
I couldn't kind of speak to any particular details on that. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine, like a lot of things, federal funding is very much tied up into it. Yeah. Which is, of course, why we've got to unravel that kind of federal control through these dollars. And I will say, I do think that tax nullification as an idea is one prong of what I think needs to be a much bigger strategy. Because of course, as I mentioned, taxes aren't the only way they extract wealth from us. They borrow from our future with debt. They steal from our savings with inflation. I think that looking at something like a balanced budget amendment to tackle the debt problem is another prong on this. And looking at ways we can combat inflation, their ability to inflate the currency from the state level, whether that's legalizing competing currencies or putting more pressure for an audit of the Fed, or things that we can do to kind of erode the dollar monopoly over control over our financial system. I mean, I think that all of these tactics need to be done together. Of course, if we only kind of cut off their ability to tax for unconstitutional spending, and we don't address their ability to borrow trillions of dollars they don't have, or just reach into our savings with inflation, where it's like you put your finger in the dam in one place and another kind of spot opens up. So we do need to have kind of I think a holistic look at how do we restrain all three measures in which the feds extract wealth from us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm told I got 5 more minutes, so yeah.
It's a little off topic, but since you work with Ron Paul, I'm just curious to know, with his End the Fed campaign slogan, really,
Yeah.
why do you feel that wasn't as successful as it should have been? Because ultimately, ending the Federal Reserve and its legitimacy, because it's not legitimate, wouldn't that solve the whole problem? Because the monetary system itself is the problem, because they're printing money out of thin air, and most of the money that the taxpayers are paying are actually going to pay that debt. So it's an illegitimate process, and that ultimately was, I think, what made him popular. But I'm just curious to know why you think that was abandoned. Was he forced to abandon that? Was he pressured, or why do you think it just didn't take off? Because that would be the solution, in my opinion.
So I guess I would say this. I guess it all is a matter of perspective. I don't think his efforts to end the Fed were a failure. I think his efforts to end the Fed are succeeding. It's just a very slow burn. I think we look at the rise of Bitcoin is a clear example of a non-governmental effort to end the Fed, or at least to end their monopoly control. I'm working on a project right now where I'm compiling a lot of like old kind of Ron Paul interviews and stuff right now for a project that I can't disclose at this point. But I remember I was watching this interview from, I think, back in 2011, and someone asked him this question, the title of your book is End the Fed. You really want to abolish the Federal Reserve? Do you think something like that can pass through Congress? And he said, well, no, I don't, I'm not really calling for the, it'd be nice if Congress abolished the Federal Reserve tomorrow, but I don't think that's actually what's going to happen. He says, what I really want is to legalize competing currencies, and I think the Fed will end itself, because they won't be able to compete in a marketplace where sound currencies exist. And I think, Congress is never going to do it. Washington, D.C. is never going to do it. Now, states are taking the lead. We look at states like Wyoming that are creating a good environment for competing currencies and cryptocurrencies. I think these undermine the monopoly control of the Federal Reserve. And it never happens as quickly as we would like. I mean, I wish that we had elected Ron Paul president 10 years ago, and Ron Paul, with an executive order, just abolished the Fed and ended the wars, and we were living in our kind of Ancapistan utopia right now. But it's a slow burn. I think that there are a lot of forces at work, economic forces at work, that are going to ultimately prove that the Federal Reserve will be destroyed and will end, but it's ending itself through inflation and the rise of competing currencies.
And you wouldn't want to continue that, because I think that's ultimately the solution. Maybe you could pick up on that and try to...
Yeah, I mean, I would very much like to see Wyoming used as a model for what they've done there. That was actually a House Coalition legislator there now, who's now staffer for Senator Cynthia Lummis, who's leading the charge for cryptocurrency and Bitcoin freedom on the federal level. I think Wyoming is a great example of some model legislation there that we can look at passing across the states to undermine the inflation power of the federal government.
Good luck to you.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. I'm told I got 1 minute left, so I don't see any more questions, so we'll say that's the last question. I appreciate everyone coming out and listening to this crazy idea that I have. I guess furthermore, my opinion is the Federal Reserve should be destroyed. Talk to you all later.